$1 note from Zimbabwe from 2008. There's something, goodness knows what that is, but it's from Germany in the early 1920s. But, excuse me for being a bit facetious, you have to sort of shoot most of your farmers to get the first of that problem. You have to destroy your productive capacity. That was the problem in Zimbabwe. Destroy your productive capacity, alienate most of the rest of the world and get sanctions put on you at the same time. Of course, food prices will skyrocket, and then if you print money to pay for non-existent things, then you get hyperinflation. And Germany? Well, if we were to start, well, I'm not saying they started, if we had a world war and we lost, and whoever won asked us for vast amounts of gold, and the only way we could possibly get this gold was to print lots of our own money. And the people we were giving that money to, where could they spend it? Only in our country. And if we just had a famine in our country and decimated our productive capacity, yes, you can get hyperinflation. But if that's the best you've got to throw at me, Zimbabwe in 2008 and Germany in 1923, it's not even worth dwelling on. Moreover, and I do need to go quickly now because I don't want to go on all night, and I've just communicated one important thing, which is our government can't run out of money. So you don't need to worry too much about a budget deficit, and in fact the government's nearly always had a budget deficit. There's something else I have to tell you too. The thing that's unsustainable is a budget surplus, not a budget deficit. It's the other way around. There is no such thing in a country like Australia as a sustainable budget surplus. I'm just about to show you why. The government budget, I'm about to say, can only move towards surplus if somebody else moves towards deficit. It's just the way the financial system works, or to put it another way, it's the way numbers work. The government budget can only move towards surplus if the private sector goes further into debt. In Australia, in recent years, this means more household debt. Households are not able to do this forever, and in fact hardly able to do it much beyond where we've got to now. If they do it for a while, it would go with the property bubble inflating again, and we'd end up with a worse crash, and we really would test how much reserves of capital the big Australian banks had if that happened. The Howard Costello surpluses were built on a mountain of dangerous household debt. Why is it the Labour Party can't point this out? The Greens should be pointing out, actually. The Howard Costello surpluses were the worst financial management that the Australian government perhaps has ever had, and I am including the 1970s. Because we've got a dangerous debt mountain. The debt mountain is the debt of people who don't own printing presses. There's something from Paul Krugman that I saw a few weeks ago on his blog, his New York Times blog. What we thought was normal. Paul is on the verge of modern money theory, but is reluctant to publicly go over. There are some modern money theorists who are friends of his. The same thing is true, by the way, of Joseph Stiglitz. They're on the edge. What we thought was normal actually depended on ever-growing household debt. More true here than even in the US. Didn't I show you who's the world champion of household debt? We are. Now, very quickly. For every borrower, there has to be a lender. Yes? I mean, there's various ways of explaining this. Phil would do it another way. Economists generally do it another way. I spent a lot of time training bankers who don't like equations so much as economists do, so this is the way I'm going to explain it. For every borrower, there is a lender. Every financial liability, well, that's a commitment, generally, that a borrower has to provide resources to the lender in the future, is also a financial asset. If I lend money to you, that loan is a financial asset for me, it's a financial liability for you. We're both in the private sector, so if we were talking about the whole private sector, it would net out, actually, in that case. Across our whole financial system, if you net everybody out, then borrowers and lenders have to cancel out. By definition, borrowing and lending, when you add it all up, if borrowing is a minus and lending is a plus, it has to come to naught. Not complicated. It's common to aggregate a bit. It's common to discuss three sectors. The private sector, which includes households and businesses. The government sector, which the numbers I'm going to look at in a minute, they don't match up to the earlier numbers because it means the whole government sector here. And the foreign sector, which is the rest of the world. Net lending on the Australian financial system, well, they could net borrow, but they don't. They can't all be in surplus at the same time. If the government overall is running a budget surplus, that means the government is a plus, the government's a net lender. Somebody else has to be a net borrower. It's just a fact. A chart. Now, don't worry too much about this chart. You can see there's a horizontal line there at 0. Those three sectors I was just talking about, if one of the sectors, the foreign sector for Australia, is always above 0. If one of the sectors is above 0, it means they're running a budget surplus. The rest of the world, with Australia, every year for ages has run a budget surplus, which is another way of saying Australia has a current account deficit on its balance of payments and has for a very long time. It's kind of similar to a trade deficit. It's a tiny difference between the two, but you can think of it as a trade deficit. We import more from the rest of the world than we export. So the foreign sector is above the line. That means somebody else has to be below the line. By definition, it's the way the financial system works. Now, we usually like to see the government below the line because we usually like to see, and historically this has been the normal set of circumstances, we usually like to see the private sector a bit above the line. Because if the private sector is above the line, it's net saving. If the private sector is above the line, it's accumulating net financial assets over time. Its balance sheet's getting stronger. Our economy's not relying more and more on private debt. But look what happened. Look what happened during the Howard years. You see the green line going above 0? If I'd left out the other levels of government, it would be above 0 virtually all the time across the period we're looking at here. What had to happen in order for our government to run a budget surplus without our economy crashing so they wouldn't have been able to run a budget surplus? The private sector had to do the borrowing. Now, in fact, in order for us to be at or near full employment, what you have to understand is that our government cannot dictate the foreign sector budget surplus with Australia. That depends on whether the rest of the world wants to put money into our financial system or not. We can influence it, but we can't determine it. Not only that, our government cannot determine precisely what the private sector does. So if there's a financial crisis, the private sector gets more cautious, doesn't want to keep borrowing as much. The private sector will go from being in deficit to going in surplus, maybe. That's what happened. The inevitable consequence of that is that the government budget will go into deficit, where it should be most of the time anyway. There are two types of deficits you can have here. You can have a deficit that supports demand, supports employment, prevents a recession, or you can try austerity. You'll get a deficit anyway, but you'll get it because the economy implodes. But you'll end up with a deficit. If you're an economist, then you'll remember fondly that equation, which is another way of saying the same thing. I won't bother you with it now. Does it make it clearer if I put the rest of the world and the private sector together? The government budget balance and everybody else's budget balance is, by definition, the same, just with the plus becoming a minus. To a considerable extent, what happens to the government budget is determined outside the government. To the extent the government has discretion over its budget balance, it should normally be running a deficit, particularly in the case of Australia. Given our relationship with the rest of the world, it'd be different if we were Norway, but we're not Norway. Given our relationship with the rest of the world, we have to, in Australia, have a budget deficit, more or less permanently, and generally speaking, significantly higher than it is at the moment, if we're going to have healthy private sector balance sheets. Another way of looking at the same thing, again, don't get befuddled by the chart, but what did I say earlier? When the government spends, it injects demand into the economy, it injects safe assets into the private sector, or more broadly the non-government sector, the private sector and the rest of the world. When the government taxes us, You can think of safe assets, dollars, demand, leaking out of the private sector. Normally, the government will net spend, so there'll be a net injection into the non-government sector of the economy. This is necessary in order to support the economy if we are net importing from the rest of the world, because some of this demand is going to leak out. If the rest of the world wants to put money into our currency, it will drive our currency up to the point where we're running a trade deficit and we'll be faced with these net imports. And the private sector will, over time, want to net save as the economy grows. As we have inflation, the private sector will want more safe financial assets. We need the government to supply it, these safe financial assets. A currency issuing sovereign government doesn't really run deficits at all. Instead, we're talking about net injections of demand into the economy and net financial assets for the private sector. It doesn't really run surpluses either. It weakens the private sector. Budget surpluses leak demand out of the economy and they leak safe assets out of the private sector. This is almost completely misunderstood by nearly everybody. Well, a couple more charts. Can you see a relationship between the private sector line, which we'd like to be above zero, just as a general rule, and the general government balance? Can you see how disastrous the Howard Costello years were? We haven't dealt with the disaster yet. Just wait for the property market crash, if and when it comes. They want to try and do that again. It won't happen. Here's the US. I told you it's not just for Australia, it's every country. Look, the government surplus, that's the red line. Surplus, it's negative here, so it's a deficit. When has the Australian government budget, sorry, the American government budget, been in surplus? I haven't got the years at the bottom, but that bit there was actually Bill Clinton. It wasn't a good thing. Clinton wasn't a good president, not from the point of view of economics. The deregulation of the financial system that allowed the GFC happened under Bill Clinton's watch. Or to put it another way, when governments run budget surpluses, the private sector, but basically they have to deregulate the financial system. They have to go easy on credit. They have to encourage the private sector to go into debt. In the US, as here, and it tends to lead to, well, we had the collapse of the US stock market, then we had easy money again, and then we had the GFC. And that's when the private sector wants to save a lot more, so of course the government budget has to go into deficit. Governments, nearly always, nearly everywhere, run budget deficits. This is a good thing. It's not building up a burden for future generations. Now, at the beginning, what did I say about Treasury forecasts? This is what they were forecasting for the next few years, before the budget, basically. After the budget, this is what they're forecasting. Therefore, the real pain is not supposed to hit for a while yet, till after the next election. And then, a budget